activities have been provided. Let me do what I always do at the beginning of these sessions, and that is say welcome to each of you and acknowledge that you have had a choice and you've chosen to come tonight. We're delighted to have you. You've heard me quote Archbishop William Temple again and again. He says the church is the only institution on earth that belongs to those who don't belong to it. That is, the church has its identity not in itself, but in the service it gives. And I hope we embody that here at St. Luke's. If you're not a member, we're so glad you've come tonight. We want to extend whatever God has given us to you. And I hope you've enjoyed the meal that you've had together. I have been smelling the cooking all day, and it has been wonderful. And you probably noticed I don't eat. I found a long time ago that if I eat before I speak, that it doesn't work very well. But I've never made a big to-do of it because I heard once of a preacher who very pompously said, I can't eat because I've got to preach. And after it was over, an old lady said, you might as well have ate. In other words, it obviously didn't help you. And so I don't claim anything for my not eating. But I have been smelling it today, and I hope you've enjoyed it very much. Russell made the announcement that there's a sign-up sheet in the back on the thing to help clean up or help serve. We're dependent on so many people week by week. Kit Morgan and her wonderful cooking crew, and also so many of you lay persons. And so if you could sign up to be of help for the next 4 times, we'd like to. And Susie Dixon said as much as we can take our dishes back before the talk starts, that just makes it easier for the people who are cleaning up. 2 quick announcements for our members of St. Luke's. Next Sunday is the Sunday closest to St. Francis Day. And so we always have a blessing of the animals on Sunday afternoon of that day. And so this Sunday at 3 o'clock out here under the porch, I'll be there, and would be so happy if you would bring your beloved animals who bless you. And it's a very simple service, and it's really lots of fun. Will you take a piece of, a little hyssop and put it in water and bless whatever animals are brought. Beg pardon? Primates too, yes. We have, I said Sunday, we had a snake about 3 years ago that he insisted that I hold while I blessed it. And I did. The worst experience I've had was a child brought a goldfish bowl, and then found out later that 30 minutes after they got home, the goldfish died. Now, you can go 2 ways with that. You can say that what I did was wrong, or I may just so fulfill their lives that they were ready to move on. At any rate, we will be here this Sunday at 3 o'clock. One other word. We're beginning our stewardship campaign. If you were here Sunday, you heard me say it. Every year when we do stewardship at St. Luke's, it's a double act of trust. We extend our trust to you, the membership, because we have no vast resources. We live from year to year by your generosity. The other act of trust is the United States Post Office. The cards went out today. A few years ago, they went to Atlanta and stayed 10 days and found their way back to Mountain Brook eventually. I pray that will not happen this year. But you should be getting your card within the next few days. And I simply invite you to do with that what the gratitude of your heart dictates. I take seriously St. Paul saying that what God loves the most is a cheerful giver, not someone who gives out of coercion or out of some sense of heaviness, but who out of the great delight of what you've been given, you imitate the giver and you share. And I would like, in that spirit, for you to take your place as one of the supporters of this enterprise. Again, we're delighted to have you tonight. Our visitors are our special gift. And I invite you to join me now in an act of prayer as we place our lives before God. Let us pray. Holy Father, we pray that you would fill us this night with the wonder of your love. Teach us in our minds how we can best use our days and nights. Strengthen us in the best resolves of our hearts. Be with us in our temptations and in our struggles. And may the fact that we sit alongside others who are serious about the faith this night be a great source of encouragement. May this night be one of the ways you use to bring us to that fullness of joy that is your reason for creating us. Into your hands, your blessed hands, we now give ourselves through Christ our Lord. Amen. Tonight is the third session in which we're studying the happiest of all the letters that St. Paul wrote, the epistle to the Philippians. I have entitled it the Epistle of Joy because if you'll go through and count, this particular word is found 16 times in these short 4 chapters. And what makes it so remarkable is that the epistle itself was written not in the sunniest of circumstances, but was written when Paul himself was in great and dire difficulty, and that he could be as joyful and as upbeat as he is in those circumstances. I hope that's going to serve as a sacrament of encouragement to all of us. Let me just very quickly remind you of the relationship that had existed between Paul and the church in Philippi. I won't dwell on this anymore, but just to give you a quick rundown on how these two entities, Paul and this church, came into existence. He first visited Philippi in 52 A.D. He had just a little while before had a dream in which a Macedonian had said, "Come over and help us." And so instead of turning to the east, which had been his intention, he crossed the Aegean Sea and landed on what we now know as Europe. And Philippi was the first place that Paul preached his gospel on what is now called European soil. And he found a group of Jewish pious women down by the river praying on a Sabbath afternoon. He preached to them, made a convert of Lydia and of some of the others, and so founded this church in Philippi. And the relationship between Paul and this church remained to be unbroken in its harmony. Twice after this, he visited Philippi. It was in Philippi that he was first arrested, had his first run-in with the Roman authorities. He was accused of disturbing the peace because he had actually converted a little slave girl who had psychic powers and was being used by her owners to make money. And when Paul introduced her to this God that is not someone we have to earn our way into whose favor, but who loves us anyway, she no longer wanted to be used, and this upset her owners. And so they accused Paul of disturbing the peace. And the peace to the Romans was very important. And so he was first arrested here, and the church in Philippi really stood by him, that they continued to believe in Paul, even though the 10 years that existed between he first found them and when this letter is written, lots of bad things happened to Paul, but they continued to stay with him. This letter was written, we think, from a prison in Rome. Paul had again been accused of disturbing the peace. He had appealed to Rome because he was a Roman citizen. He'd been taken to Rome to await trial. And it was in this place that the church in Philippi sent him some money, sent him someone to try to take care of him while he was in this prison situation. So he writes this letter to thank them for their gratitude, for their generosity, to tell them that Epaphroditus, the person they had sent, had been a great help to him. And then he writes them most of all to give them an update on how it is with him. And if you were here last week, I ended our lesson by pointing out that Paul hits head on in the very first chapter of Philippians what has to be the most perplexing single intellectual dilemma that faces any thoughtful Christian. Namely, why do bad things happen to folk who supposedly have given themselves to God and who supposedly are the recipients of the blessings of God? And his being imprisoned raised lots of doubts in certain people's minds as to whether or not God really had put his hand on Paul. For Paul to have had as hard a time as he did have, and to wind up at the end of his life in prison and maybe to be executed by Rome, this created all kinds of questions in a certain kind of mind. Well, can in fact God have really been with him? And what this poses, I tried to say last week and I'll reiterate tonight, is that to believing, thoughtful Christians, there is no greater puzzle than this whole business of how can there be so much evil and tragedy and suffering in the world if it is allegedly made by an all-good and all-powerful Creator. If you're an atheist, the biggest problem you face intellectually is how do you account for goodness? If this world is an absolutely absurd accident, just simply the result of a random Big Bang, then how do you account for people like Mother Teresa, who seem to embody such incredible goodness? But if you are a Christian believer, the dilemma is in the other way. How can you believe in a God that is all good and all powerful, and there be so much suffering and so much tragedy in the world? Many of you have probably heard of Rabbi Harold Kushner's little book, When Bad Things Happen to Good People. He's a rabbi that lives up in Massachusetts. Had a child who had a disease, and I can't call the technical name, but he aged prematurely. So by the time he was 13 or 14, he had never grown very tall. He looked like a withered old person, and he died as a result of this disease. It was a terrible blow to the good rabbi. And so he wrote this book about his experiences of trying to come to terms with this. And if you've read it, you know that Kushner says that there are three statements coming out of the faith and coming out of experience. That God is all good, that God is all powerful, and there's evil in the world. And Kushner says you can intellectually have any two of these, but you can't have all three and be coherent. For example, you can say that God is all good and there's evil in the world, but that must mean that God really isn't all-powerful. That is, God would really like to do something about all this suffering, but He is simply powerless as we are on occasions to do anything about it. It's called the doctrine of a finite God. Or, he says, you can say that God is all-powerful and there's evil in the world, but then He can't be all good. Because if God could do something about this suffering and doesn't, well, then you can't say that that is perfect goodness. Or you can do like the Christian Scientists and say that there is no evil in the world. You can leave this third one out. You know, Mary Becca Eddy and her followers had this elaborate intellectual system that said that evil is simply illusion, that it has no objective reality, and that if you simply change the way you think in your mind, that then any evidence of evil in the world simply dissolves and disappears. My favorite Christian Scientist story is about a Christian Science reader who saw a lady one day who was just suffering terribly from a disease, and she said, "Look, I can give you the key. I can give you the key that's going to solve all your problems." I said, "What is that?" She said, "If you'll get up every morning, go to the window and raise it, and inhale deeply all that fresh air. And then if you will say and really believe 3 times, every day in every way I'm better, and not let any negative thoughts enter your mind, but say every day in every way I'm better. If you'll do that for 30 days, I promise you, whatever is wrong with you will disappear." Well, the lady agreed to do it. 30 days went by. She came back, and the lady was absolutely transformed. She said, "You have given me the key. It has absolutely worked." That I got up every morning, went to the window and raised it. I inhaled all that fresh air. And she said, "I couldn't remember exactly what you said for me to say, so I just said, 'Oh, hell, I'm well.'" And it worked. Well, now, the thought is the same, even though the words are different. But, having said that, and not trying to belittle any significant religious system, I think it would be hard to convince the people in Sarajevo tonight, or the people in the Middle East. I think it would be really hard to convince them that all of the evil that they're experiencing is simply in their minds, and all they have to do is simply change the way they're thinking, and it would all go away. Now, I don't agree with Rabbi Kushner. I think there is a way to hold all three of these. These two are declarations of faith. This is an obvious experience of the world we live. I think there is a way to hold together all three. And I've done this before, but it is so basic because I have known so many people to lose any real faith in God because of the reality of evil. They experience suffering, they see suffering, and so they say there cannot be the kind of God that the Christians talk about, and so they give up on the faith. This is the toughest intellectual dilemma that any thoughtful Christian ever faces. And so I'm so anxious to try to make the point, because I think it's basic to what Paul is going to be saying in his letter. But how can we hold all three of these together? I think the clue is in how you interpret that second affirmation, namely that God is all-powerful. Now let me back up a bit, as I did last week, and give you just two quick little insights of mine into what I call a theodicy. Now, when you call to me, you got a priest and not an artist, and you know that, and so I don't claim anything for this except hopefully it will be clear. But as you heard me say so many times, I think the reason anything was created was because the mystery that is life and had life, namely this mystery we call God, at some time in the world beyond the worlds, in the time before time, that this mystery who is God said the wonder of my aliveness is simply too good to keep to myself. I want others to taste the ecstasy of being. I want others to know the wonder and the wonder of aliveness. You've heard me say it so many times. God created not to get something for God's self, but to give something of God's self. Okay, how can we experience God's kind of joy? It seems to me that two things would be necessary. First of all, we would have to have some power. It would be impossible to know God's kind of joy and be absolutely impotent and not being able to make anything happen. So, as I've said so many times before, in the beginning, when God decided to call creatures into being who could taste God's joy, I'm saying that God dealt the power that was once His and His alone. He deals it around the table, if I can use the gaming metaphor. And these, in case you can't see, these represent the human race. God took the power that was once totally under God's control, and He gives to each of the 6 billion of us who are now alive on this earth a little pool of potency, some power to make a difference in the context in which we insert that power. You and I have been given the ability to change reality and to make things happen. And what that means is that history is now not a solo, with God being the chief actor and the only actor, but history is an incredible chorus where 6 billion of us are using our power, and we are making things happen. We're making a difference by what we do. And what this means is that everything that happens is not God's intentional will. Many of the things that happen come from the fact that we who have been given power choose to use that power in ways other than God would have wanted us to use it. You and I can make a difference. We can use our power, and many times the tragedies that we experience are not because God made this happen, but because creatures who had been endowed with power have used that power contrary to the way God would use it. Now, my second image, which I used last Wednesday night, is that we had to have power if we were going to know God's joy, and we had to have freedom. An object, a stone, could not experience God's kind of joy because that is a personal kind of experience. Therefore, for us to know God's kind of joy, we had to have some potency, and we had to have a measure of freedom. And my image here is that this is our freedom. This is the pool of our power. And because we're free, we can come out of that circle of power in many different directions. We can use it the way God meant for it to be used, or we can use it contrary to the ways of love that was what God is and what God meant for us to do. And my faith is that even though we are free to come out of our circle in any direction, creatively or destructively, everything we do in our freedom moves into this second enveloping realm, which I call God's ingenious power. Now, I owe to John Bird the fact that I misspelled ingenious last week on the board. I put ingenuous up here. When you called me, you got a priest, and you didn't get somebody who could spell. And I could give you an excuse for that. I went to an experimental school for the first 2 years, the George Peabody college for teachers in Nashville had a demonstration school. And my mother had gotten a master's there, and she thought it was wonderful. So I went there for the first and second grade. And they were experimenting back in 1936 and 1937 with the flashcard method for teaching reading. So to this day, I've never really been very good at spelling. And so I thank John because I think I've got it spelled right at this point. But what I want to say is that when I say God is all-powerful, I mean by that not that God uses God's power coercively and turns us into objects. But I'm saying that the all power of God is in God's ingenious capacity to take whatever it is that we do in our freedom and somehow manage to bring good even out of the most evil intentions and the most evil consequences. I have spoken of God as the alchemist, those ancient first scientists who wanted to find a way to take lead and turn it into gold. I've spoken of the ingenuity of God as the wonder of Plan B, that when the ideal was no longer enacted, God has this incredible resourcefulness to take the freedom that we have used and the power that we have misused and still somehow bring good out of it. The whole Joseph sagas in Genesis are a wonderful, wonderful story example that ends by saying, you meant it for evil, God used it for good. And what I want to suggest is that St. Paul, I believe, thought that this is the way that human beings are put together, and this is the way that history is to be understood. So when he would have been asked, why is somebody who claims to be called by God and serving God, why has this happened to you that you're imprisoned? He would have said, this is not something that God did. I think we make a great mistake when we attribute everything that happens as if it was God's intentional will. Many people misuse their freedom and misuse their power, beginning with those folk who owned the slave girl and turned on Paul and Silas when they cured her of her dementedness, and all the people across the way that had opposed Paul and used their power to impede him. If you ask Paul, why are you in prison? He would say, because history is a chorus and not a solo. Lots of people are making a difference in what happens. But then if you would say, okay, if that's why it happened, what are you going to do? He would say, I believe in the ingenious mercy of God, that God can take even the worst of circumstances and somehow find a way to use them to be creative and constructive. And so last week, in the concluding part of our lesson, I read for you what he wrote as a way of trying to explain and answer this question of how could you be working for God and be in such terrible circumstances. I want you to know, brethren, what has happened to me has really served to advance the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and all the rest that my imprisonment is for Christ, and that most of the brethren have been made confident in the Lord because of my imprisonment, and are much more bold to speak the word of God without fear. This is Paul's way of saying, you meant it for evil. And he's talking about all the people who had impeded me. God has found a way to take even the worst and to do something good with it. Now, what Paul is really saying is, I have found a way in every circumstance to do something that will further the cause of the gospel. And the two things he identifies is that he has been able, because this has happened to him, because evil people have done evil things to him, he has been able to get to some people and to some places that he would have never gotten to had this eventuality not happened. Now, his desire was to stay as an active missionary. He wanted to go as far west as Spain to carry the gospel. His desire was that he be exuberantly free to take the gospel and plant it in as many places as possible. And his desire is thwarted by people misusing their power and their freedom. So what does he do? When he finds himself blocked in terms of plan A, he believes so in the ingenious grace of God that he goes to plan B. And what that meant was he used an incredibly meager opportunity as a way of doing something significant for the gospel. Now, I told you last week that the Praetorian Guard were the elite of the Roman soldiers. When Augustus Caesar became the head of that great Roman Empire, he picked 10,000 of his best soldiers, and he put them in what was called the Praetorian Guard. They were the emperor's bodyguards. They were the best, and he asked of them to do the most difficult things. And one of their duties was to guard any prisoner that was waiting for some kind of settlement in the Roman judicial system. Now, as best we can tell, Paul, when he appealed to Rome to adjudicate his case, he was taken to Rome, and he was put under house arrest. And for 2 years, he waited for his chance to get to make his case to the Caesar. And I take it some things never change, and therefore the Roman judicial system, I know we've got judges and lawyers here tonight, but it moves very slowly sometimes. I mean, sometimes you have to wait and wait and wait for anything to ever get finally settled in any kind of law system. Maybe the only thing slower is getting out of a parking garage. I go down to UAB Hospital, and I was down there the other day, and it was just about 3 o'clock, and here I was trying to get out, and there was just car after car lined up, and people were slow getting change, and the lady in the booth was in no hurry whatsoever. And I just sat there for what seemed like eternity. Finally got up to the gate to give my clergy pass, and the lady in the booth is obviously a very conservative and articulate Christian, and so she has this sign in the window, "Where will you spend eternity?" And I swear my first thought was, probably sitting here in this line, trying to get out of this garage. Well, I'm simply trying to point out that some things in our society are very slow, and the judicial system in Rome was very, very slow. And so for 2 years, Paul is imprisoned. He's under kind of house arrest. It was not the kind of punishing prison that you might think of. He was allowed to rent his own house. People would come back and forth and see him. But the one thing that was required was that one of the Praetorian Guards would be chained to him 24 hours a day. In fact, we have found archaeologically some of the cuffs. There's a 5-foot piece of chain, and one would be on the wrist of the prisoner, and one would be on the wrist of the guard that was assigned the duty of seeing that this person didn't escape. And so for 2 years, Paul is never by himself for a single minute. For 2 years, he finds himself in a confined situation where there is this Roman guard sitting 5 feet away. And so what does Paul do? He uses this situation as a chance to show love to these Praetorian guards who are linked to him. He uses this occasion to get to know them, to care about them, to show them affection. Remember, Jesus loved each person he ever met as if there were none other in all the world to love, and loved all as he loved each. And this one had so informed Paul that he took the occasion, since I can't go anywhere, and I've only got one person to be with at a time, I'm going to use this occasion to show the love of Christ, and I'm going to tell these people about the God whose love is absolutely incredible. The God that you don't have to do anything to get him to love you more than God already does. The God that you can't do anything to make him stop loving you. And if you'll just do the arithmetic, if there were 3 guards a day for 2 years, 365 days a year, it meant in the course of that 2-year imprisonment, Paul personally encountered over 2,000 of those Praetorian guards, and I can imagine that the way he chose to be to them, which is loving and caring, must have caused incredible conversation. And I can imagine that not just the 2,000 that drew the duty of having to guard him, but they began to talk to their other colleagues and said, there is this strangest little Jew over there. He's not like the rest of the prisoners. He's not filled with resentment and anger. He's not always trying to escape. In fact, it is incredible When you sit down with him, it looks like he'd rather be with you than anybody else in the world. He asks you about yourself, your story, about your family, and then he tells you his understanding of this God, that there's a smile on his face, and that he came to earth and lived in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. And I can imagine in those 2 years that Paul is not exaggerating when he says that by virtue of what has happened, the gospel has been advanced. The whole Praetorian Guard has become aware of Christ. They have had a chance to touch what it is that I speak of when I speak of the reality of Christ. He used that most meager of opportunities to do the thing that was available. It was Plan B. It was taking something that looked from the outside to be lead and turning it by divine alchemy into the goal of Christian witness and Christian love. I read the other day that one of the most powerful dynamics in most Christian conversions is the quality of envy. And I was a little puzzled, and I read on, and what the man said was that many people become Christians because they see in another person something that they know that they don't possess in themselves and they would like to have, and so they inquire of that person, where did you get this peace? Where did you get this capacity to forgive and to stay serene and to stay loving? I've said to you before that an answering witness is usually more powerful than a telling witness. You can walk up and buttonhole somebody on the street and say, Jesus saves, and that may or may not have much impact on them. If you act in a way that a person on the street is actually intrigued, if they have never seen anybody be loving in those kind of unloving circumstances, if you're standing in line when an airplane has been canceled and you don't blow up in rage at the lady behind the counter, but somehow stay loving in the way that you relate, it could be that somebody's going to tap you on the shoulder and say, I'm curious, where do you get the capacity to cope with this kind of stress with such grace? And then if you say, well, if there is a source, it's Jesus Christ, and the way He did His life and the way He gives me the power to do my life, I think an answering witness has incredibly more power than a telling witness. And that, I think, is what we can say about St. Paul's impact on the elite soldiers of the Roman Empire. And there is good evidence that that quiet one-on-one witness did produce some remarkable people that became a part of the Christian movement. And again, I say, one of the chief dynamics in authentic Christian conversion is often the feeling of envy. Where did you get the power to do what you did under the kind of pressure that you were under? I remember years ago, a Baptist seminary classmate of mine told me that in an evening service in his church, a lady came down and expressed her desire to affiliate with the church and make her initial Christian conversion. And he was always anxious to know how people had come to these decisions, and so he made an appointment with her the next week and went to talk to her. And she told him this remarkable story that she worked, this was years ago now, that she worked as a long-distance telephone operator. And this was back in the days, when an operator would call you and ask you if you're willing to accept the charges, or ask if you were the person that was the person call was being placed to. And this lady said that I worked the night shift. I worked from 11 at night until 7 in the morning. And she said about 2 weeks ago, I had to place a person-to-person call in the middle of the night. And she said I always hated to do that because I almost always wake somebody up. But at 1 a.m., I woke up this person and said, you have a call from this person. He said, I'm sorry, you must have the wrong number. And then he gave his number, and sure, I had made a mistake. And it was the wrong number, and I apologized. And she said, most of the time when you do that, there's a burst of profanity. But she said the voice on the other end of the line said sleepily, well, that's quite all right, young lady. God bless you and good night. And she said, I was really astonished. She said 2 days later, I, for some reason that I can't explain, made the same mistake in the middle of the night, and as soon as I heard the voice and realized that I'd made the mistake, I just felt terrible that twice I had waked this man up. And so when I acknowledged again the mistake and begged his forgiveness, she said, I was amazed that that same sleepy voice said, that's quite all right, young lady. God bless you and good night. She said, I broke company policy by saying, wait a minute, sir. I need to know what there is about you that prompted you to respond now twice to what, in my experience, most people are absolutely infuriated about. And the gentle voice on the other end of the line said, well, I didn't realize that there was anything unusual, but if there is anything unusual, I just have to say it's because I'm trying to do with my life what I see Jesus Christ having done with his life. And she said, I resolved that night, I've got to find out more of where somebody gets that kind of power to have that kind of grace in the middle of the night. Now that's what I call conversion through envy. That is when people see in another a quality that they know they don't have but would like to have and move toward the source. And I find myself uncomfortable as I talk about this because I have to wonder, have I ever created much curiosity in the people that watch me operate? You know, someone has said, if you were arrested and accused of being a Christian, would there be enough evidence to convict you? That is there enough about your behavior that if that were the charge, that there would be evidences in what you do that they would substantiate it? I need to live with that because I'm afraid so oftentimes I react to people and give them back what they're giving to me instead of responding to people out of that great grace that is Jesus within us. Well, St. Paul took the occasion of being chained to one person and took it as a way of saying what happens to you makes a difference to me, and then telling them where it all came from. And so that's how he could say what has happened to me, which may look like to you a denial of the fact that there could be a God, because the power of God is not coercive, but ingenious. I want to say that what's happened to me in the incredible alchemy of God has actually served to advance the gospel. I've gotten to people I've never gotten to before. Other believers have been emboldened by my example to be bold in their own witness. Some people, if I acknowledge, have used the occasion to try to shame me and try to get ahead of me, but I really don't care. He ends by saying, for whatever reason people have responded, since Christ is proclaimed, I rejoice. And then we get to the section which is our topic for tonight, which again begins with this word. He has just said, I rejoice over what has happened to me in prison. Yes, and I shall continue to rejoice, for I know that through your prayers and the help of the Spirit of Jesus Christ, this, what's happening to him, will turn out for my deliverance, as it is my eager expectation and hope that I shall not be at all ashamed, but with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And what he's saying is that I know how Christ has brought me up to this moment, and I'm going to continue to rejoice because I'm going to trust in two kinds of power. I'm going to trust in what you can do for me in your prayers, and I'm going to trust in what the help that comes from the Spirit of Jesus can enable me to do in the future. He has reported that what had happened led to the advance of the gospel. He says, I believe that's going to continue. And it's interesting, he looks to human prayers as a kind of empowerment as well as to the power of Jesus. Let me pause here and say that I don't know how you understand the whole mystery of prayer, and it has many different faces to it. But I would just like to acknowledge my own faith that prayer can be a form of generosity. Prayer can be a way of my giving you a certain kind of strength that makes your situation more workable because I have given you some of what I have. If I gave you $100 to put on your light bill, then that would change what you face if you had to go to the light bill place. If you were carrying 100 pounds and I offered to carry 50 of them, my offer of my physical strength would change your situation. Let me say, I believe that prayer is a form of spiritual energy, a kind of courage. And if we are willing to share that in intercession through God in behalf of another person, I think we actually give the other person more power to work with to meet their situation. I read a novel by Charles Williams several years ago, and there's a little story within the story about a man who believed what I do about prayer. His name was Peter Stanhope. He was the director of a community theater, and they were having auditions for parts one night. And a woman came to try out one of the parts, and as she had read for it, Peter said to her quite gently, I really think you have some potential to be a part of this play, but I need to ask you something personal. Why are you so frightened? Why do your eyes always dart back and forth as if you're expecting some terrible thing to happen? And the woman's face flushed, and she said, well, I've just had an experience, and I've had it many times before, that absolutely unnerves me. She said, as I was coming to the theater tonight, I met a mirror image of myself walking toward me. And said, it's absolutely frightening. I feel like I'm losing my mind. This is a fantasy. I see myself as if I'm somebody else walking toward me. And Peter Stanhope said, well, that's not an abnormal experience. Goethe, the great German writer, he reports having had the same kind of thing. He said, I don't know, it may have something to do with the mental illness of multiple personalities. I don't know what it is. But he said, don't you have Christian brothers and sisters who can bear this burden of fear with you? And she said, I don't know what you're talking about. He said, well, St. Paul says, bear one another's burdens, and what we can do is that we can give each other energy through our prayers so that the fear that they are experiencing can be borne by us instead of by them. He said, for example, if you would enter into a covenant with me, as of tonight, I would agree to bear the fear that you have any time that experience happens. Which means that if you should ever see that image of yourself walking towards you again, say simply, Peter Stanhope is handling this fear. Route all the apprehension in his direction. And he said, I can bear your fear with much less power than you can because I'm not threatened as you are. And if you'll let me bear that burden, then that will free you to use all your powers to cope with whatever is in front of you. And she said, it's too easy. He said, well, if it has to be complicated for you, it has to be. But I promise you, this is the doctrine of substituted love. This is the way we can bear one another's burdens. And if you ever want to activate our covenant, I invite you to do it. The play auditions were over. She went home that night, and when she got home, she calls Peter Stanhope. And she said, for the first time in 20 years, I realized walking home that I saw the stars. I saw leaves on the tree for the first time in my life. I'm not absolutely fixated on fear. And she said, it must have been that you were bearing my burden of fear, and that freed me to see. And he said, of course. I believe that. I don't do this carelessly, but many times if people are facing operations, I'll tell them that story, and I will offer to bear their fear for them, which frees them to use their power to cope with what they're up against. Today we have a thing called call forwarding. Your call gets routed to some other number. Okay, think of it as call forwarding. But I honestly believe if we're willing to be generous with our spiritual energy as well as our money and our physical strength, that we can bear one another's burdens. And I think St. Paul believed that. And I think he thought that because the Philippian church was actually giving him some of their energy through their prayers, that he had more to work with than if they hadn't been praying. And then, of course, he really did believe that Jesus had meant what he said when he said, lo, I'm with you always. He said to his disciples right before he died, if you're brought before the magistrates and if you're brought before people that are trying to accuse you, don't worry about what you're going to say, because I'll be there with you and I'll give you the words that you need as you need them. This is the promise that we are not alone, that there is the divine energy of Christ as well as our human energies. And not only are other humans bearing our burdens for us, but the fact that Jesus Christ himself is a part of our situation. When I was working on my doctorate back in my seminary days in 1957, I guess it was, I had 5 fields that I was responsible for. I had to take 5 4-hour exams at the end of 2 years to complete my residency. And I spent all summer of 1957 studying, trying to fill my mind with as much as I could possibly learn, because I was to take those exams 1st of September. And this was long before air conditioning, and I would stay up late at night and it would be so hot. And I remember one night my fears just got the best of me. I began to think of all the questions they could ask, of all the books I hadn't read. All this 2 years of labor could go right down the drain and I could fail. And the pain and anxiety was so acute that I remember I got up from where I was studying and just went out in the yard because I was almost trembling with fear. And as I stood out in the yard and looked up into the night, from somewhere those words of Jesus came, "When you are called before the magistrates, have no fear, because in that moment you will be given the word that you will need." And suddenly it dawned on me, I wasn't going to have to take those exams by myself. Now, Jesus wasn't going to do it for me and me just lie down and do nothing, but I didn't have to do it all by myself. And the help that comes from the Spirit of Jesus Christ is something you can tap into wherever you are. It is always available, and it can, realizing that it's we and not just I, it can make all the difference in the world. And so he says, I believe that through your prayers and the help that comes from Jesus, that I'm going to be able to not be ashamed. I'm going to be able to face whatever may happen in the future. And then suddenly he says, I will, but it with full courage, now as always, Christ will be honored in my body, whether by life or by death. And suddenly St. Paul ushers us into the deepest parts of his soul. Christ is something you can tap into wherever you are. It is always available. Let me pause and say it's a sign of the deep bond that existed between Paul and his church that he would dare to open up his heart in this way. If you could read the next paragraph in the original Greek, it is broken. It doesn't make very good syntax. Paul is here, obviously very, very up against it. He is struggling. He sees the dark at the end of the tunnel as something very, very real and very possible. And so what you have here is a kind of soliloquy. What you have here is somebody thinking out loud. What you have somebody is honestly unpacking his heart. St. Paul could be arrogant. St. Paul could be utterly unforgiving as he was with John Mark, but he could also be wonderfully vulnerable. He could sometimes pull back the veil from his heart and let you see what was going on inside. And in the 7th chapter of Romans, he says, I'm just mystified by my own behavior. The good that I want to do, I wind up not doing it. The evil I don't want to do, I find myself doing it. With my mind, I embrace the will of God, but in my behavior, I find it so hard to do. He lets us see there's a struggle that went on inside his soul, and it's the same kind of thing in these words that follow. Because he says, I have confidence that Christ will be honored, but it may be that he's going to have to be honored in my martyrdom and not in my being included. And then words that are so familiar. For to me to live is Christ, and die is gain. If it is to be life in the flesh, that means fruitful labor for me. Yet which I shall choose, I cannot tell. I am hard pressed between the two. My desire is to depart and be with Christ, for that is better. But to remain in the flesh is more necessary on your account. Convinced of this, I know that I shall remain and continue with you all for your progress and joy in faith, so that in me you may have ample cause to glory in Jesus Christ, because I will be coming again. Now, there are two things as we see Paul being honest here that stand out. First of all, he is obviously not afraid to die. He says, for me to live is Christ. Christ has so shaped my life, the way I do it and the power I get to do it comes from Christ. And to die is gain. Later on he says, my real desire is to depart, military term, strike tent, to move on. He said, my real desire is to depart and be with Christ, which is far better. And what this says to me is that Paul had really finally let the gospel get down into the very marrow of his spirit. He had come to believe with his whole being that the love of God is everlasting, that the love that God gives to us is bigger than our life and time and space. He had really come to believe that in the Father's house are many dwelling places, that time and space is simply one schoolroom where the love of God is given to us. And he honestly believes that death, this thing that none of us have experienced, is really a graduation, it is a promotion, it is moving into the next level of God's everlasting love. And so, as he said in Corinthians, the last enemy to be overcome is death. And I would say that in these words he demonstrates that that has happened. He is no longer afraid to die. And I'd like to say to you that I think that one of the goals of the Christian life in history is to so fill us with trust in God's love that when we get to the end of our journey and we have to say if there's anything else but God, because when we die we will be totally helpless. I think the purpose of our life in time and space is to give us enough experience of God's love that when we have to lie down in the hands of death, we will not be afraid, because we will believe that what lies beyond the darkness into the trouble is something better, is an experience more appropriate to our next stage of growth than what we have experienced in time and space. Now, coming to that kind of faith doesn't come quickly or easily. It is an essence of trust. The last enemy to be overcome, I believe, is the fear of death. And here in St. Paul, it's clear that death no longer has to motivate him. He has become so convinced that God is love, that God's love is larger than life, is stronger than death, that when he contemplates what it's going to be like to move out of this world, he doesn't see it as annihilation, he doesn't see it as awesome, terrible judgment. He sees it as being translated, as being promoted, as being graduated. That's the next level. And I hope that what we do here at St. Louis is building up your trust in that God. There's nothing you can do to make him love you any more than he already does, and nothing you can do to make him stop loving you, because the love comes from what he did, and not how well and important he is. So, he's not afraid to die, and he is profoundly unselfish. Because what he says is that though I personally am tired, I've lived a hard life, and I'd love to start again and move on into that better place that I believe is our country, I realize that I'm needed so that your faith can grow. I realize that my staying in history is really something that would be better for you. And therefore, here you have a kind of reenactment of Gethsemane. Jesus says, here, O God, is what I would like. Remove this cup from me. But not my will, but yours be done. St. Paul is following Jesus here by saying, I've decided that it would be better for you if I remain, and therefore I'm convinced that that's what's going to happen. And so he says, with a great sense of confidence, I'm convinced that I will remain and continue with you, so your part is enjoying faith. And then he says, I will come and see you. And I bet when this was read for the first time in the Philippians church, great applause for that. Paul knows he's going to be a priest. Paul knows that is his honest realization that death is staring you in the face. It comes back because in the last term, only makes you remember one. Whether I come and see you, what you just said, I'm going to do. Or I may hear that you're standing firm in one faith, with one mind striving side by side for the faith of the gospel, and not frightened by anything. For it has been granted to you for the sake of Christ that you should not only believe in him, but also suffer for his sake. In other words, Paul doesn't want, for all of his confidence in what he can mean, because he doesn't want them to think expectantly to come to him. He is saying, whether I am acquitted and come to you, or whether I never get to see you again, I want you to live out the same fulfillment that I'm living out of. And then he makes a very, very you are free. Not just to believe. That one of the great graces is the same thing that happened to me. I didn't want to do it. But finding myself in prison, he was saying, it is the highest compliment that Jesus could pay you to ask you to suffer for him. That is, in situations that are not for your liking, find the way that you can demonstrate what Jesus can do with the life that he's committed to you. And therefore he is saying, it is your privilege not only to have believed in Jesus, but now to get to suffer for him. In an army, it's the highest compliment a soldier can be paid to be given a difficult assignment. I was once the chaplain of a volunteer fire department in Kansas City, Tennessee, and we'd meet once a month for dinner, and they'd talk about their plan. And those who were the best firemen always had the most asked of them in a difficult situation. Can you believe that God is really showing his favor to you? That God is really saying, I see in you a great deal of strength by asking you not just to have an easy time of it, but if you find yourself in a situation like Paul found himself in, if you find yourself up against it, instead of saying, why did this happen to me, to ask, how can I use this to let Christ come through me and make a difference? In other words, it is a privilege to be put in a difficult space and therefore have the chance to demonstrate to the world what God can do with a person that opens themselves to his will and says, even in the worst of times, I believe, Lord Jesus, that you can do the best with me. I have a friend who's my age that studied medicine at Baylor with me. He decided to be a medical missionary, went and served with great distinction in Africa. His wife got sick and he had to come back, so he very, very adaptively began to be a surgeon in Oklahoma City. And 2 years ago, Christmas, he and his family went out to Colorado skiing. And as he was coming in to lunch, skiing, he's a very good skier. Somehow his skis caught and he went over on his head, and it snapped his spinal cord, and he has spent the last 2 years as a quadriplegic. He's just like Christopher Reeve. He can't move any part of his body. He can breathe only with the help of oxygen. The only movement that he can make is his head. Mind is clear, but those surgeon hands that once were the agents of great blessing are now absolutely impotent and helpless. The way he has strapped on this last thing that he has lived with has been an incredible witness. Because never once has he complained, never once has he been bitter, never once has he lifted, can't do a physical fist, but a mental fist in the face of God. Never has he asked, why did this happen to me? That good man has only asked, how can I use this terrible, terrible circumstance to demonstrate what the ingenious God has done and can do through him. And those who are closest to him tell me that his witness in these last 2 years, when he has been utterly physically helpless, are more powerful than all he did in Africa and all he did as a soldier. That is, he let the terrible thing that happened to him physically, he turned it into a privilege to demonstrate what Christ can do. I would invite you in your tough places not to ask, why did this happen? Ask, how, O Christ? How, O Christ, will you use me? And it could be, in your worst of times, you'll wind up doing the best of things. And people will see that good work and know it came from Jesus. The Christian life